He is an unlikely hero, this heavy-set thug with custom-tailored suits, an 11-carat diamond pinky ring, and 3 long, menacing scars along one side of his face. But to millions of Americans in the Roaring '20s, Al Capone is just that, the champion of the common man and scourge of the blue noses. "I'm just a businessman," says Al, giving the people what they want.
There's never been a gangster like Al Capone. There's never been anybody who combined his political sophistication with his love of publicity, and who also happened to be at the right place at the right time.
In fact, he is a very keen businessman, but he operates outside the law and most tenets of decency. His bouts of rage are legendary, and his capacity to do violent harm is unequaled.
One particular tactic is to isolate his opponents and deal with them one by one.
He had a great PR style, but underneath it all was a monster.
In the underworld of Chicago, however, a reputation as a monster is considered good business practice.
When I first met him, I thought he was a wild tiger, mean as hell.
At his height, he's not only in control of the Chicago underworld, but Chicago itself, holding every politician of importance in his pocket, from the mayor to the beat cop. While he orchestrates the most bloody massacre in gangland history, he also feeds thousands of Chicago's destitute in its first soup kitchen. As his real life headlines the daily papers, his legend fills the pages of pulp novels and lights up the silver screen. Capone is a paradox, a public enemy, but a popular hero, shockingly violent, but fiercely loyal. His power and fame are unprecedented. But what drives Al Capone to such heights? Just who is the real Al Capone?
Rogues Gallery is narrated by William Devane. This episode, Al Capone.
Al Capone makes his name in Chicago during the age of Prohibition, when liquor is outlawed across the nation. The crime of taking a drink makes criminals of ordinary citizens who kick up their heels during the lawless decade, thumb their noses at government, and make heroes of the gangsters who host their misdemeanors. Alphonse Capone becomes the king of the Chicago jungle in the Roaring '20s, but his American story starts like millions of others on a boat in New York Harbor. By the turn of the century, millions of Italian immigrants have passed through Ellis Island. Among the new arrivals are a young barber from Naples named Gabriel Capone, his devoted wife Teresa, and young son Vincenzo. Settling near the Brooklyn waterfront in 1894, Gabriel sets up a shop in a rough neighborhood called the Brooklyn Navy Yard. On January 17, 1899, they celebrate the birth of their 4th son, Alphonse Capone, a first-generation American. In the Brooklyn neighborhood where he grows up, the lesson of the day, of every day, is how to get ahead. There's a single-minded energy in the streets.
Those fellows of that age, their parents had come from Europe. They were a much tougher crowd in terms of getting up there. You know, the real American spirit, Al Capone, that would have done anything to succeed.
Gregarious, charming if somewhat aggressive, he's the kid to watch in the neighborhood. It's evident from an early age that his brains will take him places if his uncontrollable temper doesn't get him into trouble first. Capone manages to hold a B average through grammar school. In the 6th grade, he's thrown out of school for punching the teacher. Young Alphonse tries his hand at a variety of odd jobs, but his real apprenticeship comes on the streets of Brooklyn as a member of a junior gang.
Kid gangs were the support for urban youth. They would run around, they would smoke cigarettes, they would do pilfering, there was probably lunch money, extortion at school, and they did an awful lot of fighting. That was the real purpose of the kid gang.
Some of those juvenile street gang kids graduated into full-fledged gangland. Others just moved on and lived normal lives. The options were pretty simple. You could either take an honest job and work hard, long hours at the same pay as everyone else, or if you didn't have a lot of moral scruples, you could work on the other side of the law, and if you survived, you could do very well, make a lot of money, and work a lot shorter hours.
At 16, Capone lands a job as a bartender and bouncer for an up-and-coming gangster, Frankie Yale, at the Harvard Inn in Coney Island. Recognizing Capone's potential, Yale becomes a willing mentor to the ambitious young man.
The Harvard Inn was a very bad dive, and that's where Al Capone served his apprenticeship. Frankie Yale, who appreciated someone of his heft, because he was big for his age, always, and very tough, and very smart. He didn't often find big and smart together in one package, and he treasured it when he got it, and Al Capone very quickly became one of his most trusted men.
At 18, Al Capone is a brash kid who knows he has a bright future in crime, but he still has a lot to learn. One night at the Harvard Inn, he learns a lesson that will stay with him for the rest of his life. The cocky teenager swaggers over to a pretty girl who is sitting with her brother, a small-time hood named Frank Galluccio.
Capone leaned over and said, "Honey, you got a great ass," and I mean that as a compliment. Frank Galluccio pulled out a knife and slashed.
And gave him 2 long scars on the left side of his face. There was a great deal of blood, although the gashes weren't very deep. And that was the basis of his nickname, Scarface, which, by the way, was a nickname that Capone himself detested.
He would put talcum powder on his face to try to hide it. He never let people photograph him on his left side, and loathed the name.
But his gruesome scars make no difference to a tall, beautiful blonde Irish girl named May Coughlin, who falls in love with his charm and spirit.
He loved her, she loved him. They were loyal to each other all their married life. Capone was notoriously unfaithful, but she didn't resent it somehow, and there was no question about his affection for her.
On December 4th, 1918, she gives birth to Capone's only son, Albert Francis. A routine errand to collect a gambling debt for Frankie Yale turns ugly when the man refuses to pay the teenage Al Capone. Furious at the disrespect, Capone impulsively shoots him. At 18 years old, Capone is now a killer.
The great lesson of Frankie Yale was crime is business. It's extortion. Quick, decisive, brutal action when needed was another great lesson.
And I think what he recognized was that, as all gangsters do, that violence is one of their important tools.
With the guidance of Frank Yale, Al Capone grows from a street thug to a full-fledged gangster. But he still hasn't mastered his ferocious temper, which sends him into a blind rage one night in a bar down by the waterfront. A tough collector from a rival Irish gang chooses the wrong Italian when he starts to bait Al Capone. Capone, using only his great ham-like fists, beats the man to a bloody pulp and leaves him for dead. The leader of the Irish gang swears to kill the tough Italian who beat up his pal. Word hits the street that he's looking for the kid with the scars.
He really had to be taken out of the reach of this madman who was going to track him down and would mercilessly kill him.
His mentor, Frankie Yale, comes to his rescue. He calls an old friend in Chicago, a powerful gangster named Johnny Torrio, and begs him to give Capone work until things cool down.
Capone didn't go to Chicago. He was sent to Chicago, and it was for his own safety.
In late 1919, Capone heads for Chicago to begin a career that will change the face of organized crime. In 1919, Chicago is a young, prosperous, vibrant, and utterly corrupt town. Politicians and businessmen, police and gangsters are all in cahoots. The city itself is divided along ethnic lines, and the neighborhoods are run by gang lords. Big Jim Colosimo, heads up a South Side Chicago domain of gambling joints and brothels. He owns the biggest slice of the pie in Chicago's underworld. Colosimo also cuts a figure in Chicago's chic cafe society as the owner of several cafes. Frankie Yale's friend, Johnny Torrio, serves as Colosimo's lieutenant. It's Torrio who takes Capone under his wing, getting him started in the organization.
When Capone arrived in Chicago, he went to work for Johnny Torrio in the organization as a bathhouse attendant in a brothel and later on as a pimp.
Well, he started off, of course, at the bottom. He's another hired hand. But the same combination of smartness and toughness, Torrio twigged to it immediately and very, very quickly was elevating Capone.
Torrio knows people and he knows business. He's primed and ready when his big break comes. On Capitol Hill, Congress is unwittingly setting the stage for a new era in American gangsterism. While soldiers fight World War I overseas, conservative groups push a new amendment through Congress, outlawing the sale of liquor in America. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment Prohibition goes into effect.
Well, America voted for it, but the returning soldiers didn't like the idea.
They fought a war. They wanted to have a good time. All of a sudden, they're faced with prohibition. They can't drink. So everybody became a rebel.
The effect of prohibition was to place large parts of society outside the law. So it made most Americans, ordinary law-abiding Americans, into lawbreakers by the simple fact of taking a drink.
The coming of prohibition to Johnny Torrio was like getting handed the winning lottery ticket. It was wide open. He knew that it was going to be money that they could not even imagine.
But Colosimo has come to like being a part of legitimate society. He worries that his reputation will suffer if he gets into the prohibition trade.
Big Jim Colosimo, being reluctant to enter into bootlegging, his own gang recognized that Big Jim was a problem, and they retired Big Jim in a hail of bullets. So the opening of Prohibition gave John Torrio his chance to climb to the top and also to get involved in a multi-million-dollar business.
One of the contradictory and paradoxical things about Prohibition was that it didn't end or even lessen drinking in this country. It increased it. In fact, it probably doubled it.
The Roaring '20s was a lot of fun. You know, Chicago was never dry. They had taverns. They call them speakeasies. They had speakeasies in every corner.
Torrio really understood crime not only as business, but as wholesale business. He thought big. He always saw things in terms of cartel, of cooperation, of serving the public's less attractive needs.
Torrio knows that the biggest problem facing him is the heated rivalry among Chicago's many ethnic gangs. In an unprecedented move, he gathers the feuding leaders of Chicago's underworld to talk business.
Look at, instead of competing and driving the prices down, and also competing by shooting each other, why don't we just all get together and form a little cartel agreement along geographical lines?
He knew that everybody could make a lot of money. There was plenty for everyone. They didn't have to go around killing each other.
The truce among the fierce rivals turns more profit than anyone dreamed of.
By 1922, Chicago was a series of gangs that had carved up the city, and they were making a fortune. That's what Al Capone really learned from Johnny Torrio, how to smooth things over. Torrio would go into a neighborhood where they were going to open a gambling place or another whorehouse or something. He bribed everyone in sight, but he did more than that. He'd go to the neighbors and say, what do you need? Do you need your roof fixed? Do you need an operation? Here, let me take care of things for you. Just don't make trouble. I don't want any trouble.
He also learned from Johnny Torrio the idea of living in a respectable fashion, so that throughout his years in Chicago, Capone maintained the illusion of a respectable bourgeois existence. He lived with his wife and his son and his mother, and occasionally a few brothers would visit in a house on South Prairie Avenue that was in an ordinary middle-class neighborhood.
Torrio wins Capone's loyalty by rewarding the young man's hard work, and Capone, in turn, appreciates Torrio's faith in him. The two men complement each other. Torrio's acute criminal mind but cautious nature are supported by the younger man's fierce sense of loyalty and brutal temper. Torrio and Al Capone control the South Side. But in 1923, gang rule is challenged by newly elected reform mayor William Deaver. He's as cold as a Chicago winter and bad weather for bootleggers. Soon the police are raiding distilleries everywhere.
So what Capone and Torrio decided was, well, maybe it would be good if we had a base outside the city so as not to take the heat in Chicago.
In Cicero, Capone learns a valuable lesson: the power of politics. Business can run a lot more smoothly if you have local government on your side.
There were two slates running in Cicero. It was the Republican politicians who reportedly actually came to them and said, hey, if you help us beat the Democrats in the election, we're your pals. You can, come into Cicero then.
It was like the worst election in this area's history. There were sluggings, kidnappings, shootings. It was just total mayhem.
When Torrio returns from a trip to Italy, Cicero is effectively in Capone's pocket. His mentor couldn't be more pleased. Despite the profits for everybody, egos are suffering among other gang leaders. And in the summer of 1924, the fragile truce begins to fall apart as gangs clamor for more power.
But, these are guys who are not businessmen, they're criminals. They're used to getting their way, and they're used to power and having a lot of it.
Chief instigator is a florist by day and a racketeer by night named Dion O'Banion. In a cunning move, he sells a brewery to Johnny Torrio, claiming that he's getting out of the racket. Torrio, eager to see him go, buys the brewery, which is promptly raided by the police. As planned by O'Banion, Torrio is caught in the raid and now faces jail time.
When he sold the Sebring Brewery to Johnny Torrio and it promptly got raided, that was pretty much, it was going to be a war after that.
Within weeks of the betrayal, Torrio and Capone used the occasion of Mike Merlo's big mobster funeral to get their revenge. Torrio and Capone call in their old pal Frankie Yale to do the job. Being from New York, he's unknown to O'Banion.
He had with him two real stone killers, Scalise and Anselmi. Because of the huge funeral, everyone went to O'Banion's shop to get flowers. Yale called up and said, I want to order a wreath. Can I pick it up tomorrow? Stroke of genius. O'Banion was expecting to see a stranger. The strangers came in. O'Banion shook hands with the man in the middle, Yale, who grabbed hold of his hand. Scalise and Anselmi started shooting. End of O'Banion.
With O'Banion out of the picture, Torrio and Capone hoped to reestablish the peace that had fallen apart. But Earl Little Jaime Weiss, the new leader of the North Siders, is implacable. His men speed past Al Capone's car, peppering it with gunfire. As luck would have it, Capone isn't in the car. 2 weeks later, Torrio is not so lucky.
He was a family man, Johnny Torrio, and they were waiting outside one night, and they machine gunned his family, just about killed his wife. They did almost kill him. And it frightened him because he knew that life was too short. He didn't want to lose at that point.
While Torrio recuperates, his devoted protege Al Capone spends nights on a hospital cot in the next room. Torrio decides he's had enough.
He could foresee that this was going to be a tough period because they were already starting to shoot at each other again. He just turned it over to Capone and said, it's yours, I want no more of it.
A burgeoning empire of speakeasies, brothels, and gambling joints. An intricate network of business and political payoffs, and a deadly gang war. All these are now Al Capone's, but he won't run things the way the quiet and reserved Johnny Torrio did. Al Capone's got a style all his own. The wild, boozy ride that had started with Prohibition and careened along with outlaw abundance is about to get even wilder. The beer is still flowing, but the gangs have started to shoot at each other again. Torrio recognizes it and gets out. Capone recognizes it and gets ready.
Of course, the first thing Capone did, which I always get a kick out of, is he went to General Motors. And he says, I want the greatest armored car in the world.
The glass on the windshield is 1 1/4 inches thick. On the doors, it is 1 inch thick. It is all encased with steel packing. The entire car, throughout, is steel lined.
With the truce called off between the rival gangs, violence in Chicago skyrockets. It's all-out gang warfare. And there's a new business tool on the market. The Tommy gun has arrived.
The first few times they had that weapon out, the police didn't even know what could put out that many bullets in such a short period of time. So it was about 3 or 4 occurrences before they started putting together that there was some other weapon.
I think there was a nickname for it called the street sweeper, which is probably pretty accurate. A lot of these guys, they were required to carry out hits or murders when given an order, but they weren't sharpshooters by any means.
With a drum of 50 or 100 rounds in the hands of someone who even wasn't a good shot, you could cause a lot of havoc.
Law enforcement will be quick to outfit its own men with the weapon, but gangsters have them first. Capone himself orders 3. With gangland violence becoming more and more dramatic, the public is fascinated. Crime reporters even add their own spin, juicing up the jargon for their stories. A pistol is now a raw, a bomb a pineapple, and a machine gun a Chicago typewriter.
The people who broke the law, the bootleggers, if they had little wars among themselves, as Bugsy Siegel once said, we're just killing each other. It sold newspapers. It was very exciting to the public.
I mean, they weren't as boring as the guys selling shoes down the street. These were guys that dressed in great-looking suits, drove great cars. I mean, you know, life was fun for these fellas. They're up every night and parties, and I mean, the sky was the limit.
Scarface Al Capone becomes a minor celebrity in Chicago, continually showing up in the papers. At first, he's unsure how to handle the press. After following some friendly advice from Chicago Tribune editor Harry Reid, Capone learns he has a flair for giving interviews.
Harry Reid, our city editor, I always say that he educated Al Capone. He got to Al and he said, now look, Al, everybody buys your beer and they love you. He said, so why don't you act like a gentleman? Quit beating newspaper people up and so forth and so on. So he finally did. After that, you'd never know that Al Capone was a gangster. He looked and talked like a businessman, which he was, except it was against the law.
He clearly, to the public, tried to portray, you know, like a benefactor. You want liquor, I'm providing it. To some extent, some of the things he said were true. If people weren't buying it, he wouldn't be in business. And some of the best people in Chicago were buying it. So he kind of had a good point.
Now in the public eye, Capone distances his image from the seedier aspects of his trade, the brothels and bootlegging operations which support his empire. He moves his headquarters to an elegant suite in a downtown Chicago hotel. It could be any modern corporate headquarters, but this one has a series of secret passages for quick escapes.
And he conducted business the same thing the upper world did. So there was sort of admiration for his ability to achieve success.
Smiled a lot, handshaking, very friendly. To those people, they probably found it hard to believe that he was capable of all these things that they had written about him. But that was his public image. The people who seen him get upset knew that he was very capable.
In April 1926, Capone's temper shows itself again. In the anarchy of the beer wars, the O'Donnell gang from the North Side has been moving in on Capone's territory. Capone impulsively decides to take care of the O'Donnell boys himself. Big Al and his men set out to find him.
The situation had gotten so bad, it needed the general himself on the front line. And Capone was in the car with a machine gun.
Capone and his men spot the O'Donnell's Lincoln pulling up in front of a South Side speakeasy.
It turned out they weren't in the car, and by mistake, he killed an assistant state's attorney, Bill McSwiggin, and there was hell to pay for that.
Police, politicians, and the public are furious. When gangsters kill each other, that's one thing, but killing a respectable member of the law is quite another. the public presses police to catch the men responsible. It's not long before all fingers point to Al Capone. For the first time in his career, the heat is truly on. Police launch a massive manhunt for Capone, and he's forced to leave town.
The McSwiggin murder was the first time when the public really woke up and realized that Capone was a criminal, that he was not a good guy all the time.
Back in Chicago, the police raid his speakeasies and ransack his gambling joints. Even his house on Prairie Avenue is raided. Eager to restore his public image, Capone arranges a press conference for his return to Chicago.
And then once the heat had died down a little bit, possibly because people started to question a little bit, well, what was Bill McSwiggin doing out there with running around with known gangsters anyway? Then Capone showed back up again and gave interviews on the subject.
One thing that Capone was never afraid of was to talk to the press. It's sort of unprecedented in that line of work.
There wasn't anyone who doubted that Capone was responsible. On the other hand, they knew perfectly well that he had not been gunning for Billy McSwiggin.
In a city where public prosecutors party with the very men they're meant to prosecute, and the public breaks the law every day while lawmen look the other way, Capone knows just how to play the public. They talk about me not being legitimate, he says. Nobody's on the legit. You know that, and so do they. Nobody's really on the legit when it comes down to cases. Most people have to agree. Capone helps the public put the McSwiggin murder behind them with his appeals in the press. But Big Al still has to face his critics in the underworld. Capone is targeted by the leader of the North Side gang, Jaime Weiss, who is still fuming after the death of O'Banion. Jaime Weiss makes another attempt at Capone, pouring 1,000 rounds of machine gun fire into a crowded cafe where Capone is having lunch. Incredibly, only a woman bystander is hurt when glass from a shattered windshield gets in her eye. After taking the woman to the hospital, Capone decides to have a talk with Jaime Weiss. Once more, Capone reveals his fierce loyalty to those who are loyal to him.
Weiss said, "Give me Scalise and Anselmi, who actually pulled the trigger on his beloved O'Banion. You can have your peace treaty." Capone had said, and he needed the peace treaty. I wouldn't do that to a yellow dog.
They say Weiss stormed out of the Morrison Hotel, which was like on October 4th, and like on October 11th he was assassinated.
I think Al Capone was sort of moderate or average level violent for a Chicago Prohibition era gangster. He was not a homicidal lunatic. He wasn't a rabid dog. On the other hand, he wasn't a choir boy or priest either. I think later in his career, Capone used violence much more sparingly, almost more surgically.
Capone became the big fellow, really in a fairly simple way, which was to isolate his opponents and deal with them one by one. Capone did that with the various gangs. One by one, he either brought them into the fold, back into the fold, or had them killed.
Seducing the press, he weathers political and public scrutiny. After 2 years of gangland upheaval, Al Capone is the last man standing. The Chicago underworld now answers to one prince of darkness, the 27-year-old Al Capone. 27 seems young by today's standards to rule a gangland empire, but gangstering is a young man's business. Few gangsters live to grow old gracefully. Everywhere he goes, people are drawn to Al Capone. He's become the toast of Chicago. And most are surprised that this thug from Brooklyn exudes such grace and style. He's applauded everywhere, from the baseball diamond to the opera house where Chicago's elite rubs shoulders with him. Once at a racetrack, the fans give him a 5-minute standing ovation. If ever a man in a city were linked together the world over, it's Capone and Chicago.
He got so much press. He was so colorful. In many ways, he was the best-known American everywhere in the world.
While Capone may own the underworld, he also moves to solidify his place as the city's most powerful citizen. In the 1927 Chicago elections, Capone sheds his old ways of beating up his political rivals. Now, he simply buys the votes to put his candidate, Republican Big Bill Thompson, in the mayor's office.
By the late 1920s, he was actually sort of starting to take politicians over, and in some cases telling people, you don't run, this guy's going to run in your place, or you support this guy, not that guy.
He was clearly the most powerful man this city's ever known.
But his influence goes beyond politics. By his own estimate, his payroll includes 50% of the Chicago Police Department. His domain of vice generates a staggering income. In 1 year alone, he takes in $60 million from beer and liquor, $25 million from gambling halls and racetracks, and $10 million from extortion in other rackets. Capone's hold on the underworld is a frustration to many of his former rivals. An upstart from the North Side offers $50,000 for bumping off the big fella. Throughout 1927, young guns come from all over to try for the prize. But Capone, well protected, gets to them before they get to him. By the end of the summer, 10 hitmen lay dead. In 1928, he buys an exclusive retreat on Miami's Palm Island. At his sumptuous palace by the sea, he plays host to such celebrities as Joey Lewis and Eddie Cantor.
Gangsters, like everybody else, like to enjoy life when they think they're a little more settled. You've got everything running fairly well. You can turn things over to your lieutenants and be gone for a while.
I think he was just trying to separate himself from the gangs, get away from all the shooting. You figure the majority of his life was spent dodging bullets.
Al Capone has always tried to keep the peace, but never at the expense of his own business. Bugs Moran has taken to hijacking Capone's booze. On Valentine's Day, 1929, 7 men from Moran's gang await a shipment of hijacked liquor in a North Side garage. But Capone has arranged this delivery himself.
Car pulls up. Couple people in police uniforms go in. It's a raid. When they lined up against the wall, 2 people in civilian clothes came in with machine guns. Opened fire.
Within seconds, the most notorious massacre in Chicago history is over. 6 men are dead. The 7th will die hours later in a Chicago hospital, never revealing his killer.
I got so involved when I saw those bodies that nothing else mattered to me.
It hit the pages across America, all the blood and gore. It was so vicious. The idea of these fellows being mowed down in cold blood in a garage.
Details of the massacre stun Chicago and rudely waken them to the savage workings of the underworld. Bugs Moran himself breaks the gangster code when he says to the press, "Only Capone kills like that."
Where was Al Capone during all this? He was at his winter house in Miami Beach, and the day it took place, he made sure to invite the district attorney of Miami to his house for tea, so that he would seem as innocent as a lamb while this carnage was taking place in Chicago.
What happened afterwards was the closest thing during all of Prohibition to a shutdown of illegal activities in Chicago. It cost Capone a fortune.
The Chicago Crime Commission adds to his notoriety by creating a list of so-called public enemies. Al Capone, of course, is public enemy number 1. Capone's infamy has attracted national attention. President Hoover deplores the violence and calls for action. Federal prohibition agents crack down on Capone's speakeasies and distilleries. The leader is a firebrand named Elliot Ness. His daring raids provide exciting copy for the press.
He was what we called a publicity hound. He loved publicity. I thought he was a phony.
he put together a group called the Untouchables. That much is true. However, they weren't particularly well known in Chicago. They didn't have that much to do with getting Capone. Curiously enough, Eliot Ness, who was seen as a very virtuous, clean-living person, was in his lifetime a very well-known womanizer. He was married several times, and he was also an alcoholic, which was bitterly ironic, and in fact, he drank himself to death.
People still knew that Capone was bigger than Eliot Ness, and certainly bigger than the United States government at that time. I mean, no one could stop Al Capone.
Smashing stills has little effect on Al Capone or his empire. He's proven he can get away with murder. The federal government looks for another approach to bringing down the big fella.
In 1927, the Supreme Court suddenly ruled that illegal as well as legal income was taxable. This had a huge impact on gangsters because it meant that all the money they were making from bootlegging was suddenly taxable, and they were supposed to report it to the federal government. No one was affected more strongly by this Supreme Court ruling than Al Capone, and it gave the government a weapon to use against him.
In 1930, the feds target Al Capone's inner circle. His bookkeeper, Jake Greasy Thumb Gusick, his lieutenant, Frank Nitti, and his brother, Ralph Capone, all are convicted of income tax evasion and sentenced to hard time. For the big fella, it's time for damage control. He rails against the press for condemning the wrong villain. After all, isn't the Depression a bigger crime? The real hustler, he says, is the stock market speculator, a guy who wants to make money instead of producing something people need. Now get me right, I'm no angel, but I'm not as black as I'm painted. I'm human. I've got a heart in me. I'll go as deep in my pocket as any man to help anyone that needs it. Capone puts his money where his mouth is. In November 1930, he establishes Chicago's first soup kitchen. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars and feeds up to 3,000 hungry people a day.
Chicago's most notorious citizen, Al Capone, king of the gangsters, appears in a new role, that of public benefactor, when he sets up soup kitchen to feed unemployed. It costs Al $2,500 per week to feed these men.
First real meal in days, thanks to Mr. Capone's hospitality.
Best soup I had in about 5 weeks. Fine.
Sure, all these poor guys are just naturally hungry and starving now. Look what Capone's doing for these poor guys. He's doing all this himself.
Though skeptics see it as a shameless public relations ploy, his popularity soars to new heights. But soon, the nation's first underworld spin doctor will have to face his own monster. And Capone will soon learn that no power is absolute. With Uncle Sam breathing down his neck, Al Capone seems cool and collected. He's had tougher characters threaten him, and he's always managed to get through without a scrape. But part of Capone's strength comes from the men he surrounds himself with. Loyalty is sacred, and has always been something Capone could count on, until now. Two of his most trusted killers, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, have been conspiring with the head of the Sicilian Union to kill Capone. The very men whom he had refused to give up for a peace treaty with Jaime Weiss are now planning to deliver Capone in a casket.
Al Capone was known for his loyalty. He had many very bad qualities, but loyalty was one of the good ones, and he just couldn't stand the idea that someone would betray him. It was Nitti's idea to have a banquet.
In the back room of a roadhouse in Roby, Indiana, Capone holds a banquet for his inner circle with Scalise, Anselmi, and the third traitor, Joseph Ginta, as guests of honor. After feeding everyone a full meal and filling them with plenty of wine and brandy, Capone offers a toast to his special guests. He takes a sawed-down baseball bat and beats them all bloody. Their bodies are later found riddled with bullets, dumped in a lonely spot called Spooner's Neck. But not all of his problems can be dispatched with a baseball bat. Back in Chicago, federal agents pore over Capone's financial history.
The only threat Capone ever had was a man named Frank Wilson. Wilson was with the Treasury Department. He was an investigator who spent 2 years using witnesses that had worked with him, papers, books. I mean, it was a tremendous amount of investigation that he did. Based on that, they went after Capone for income tax evasion.
The press is already calling it the trial of the century. Capone soaks up the attention, bragging to reporters. They know there'd be hell in this city if they put me away. Who else can keep the small-time racketeers from annoying decent folks?
Capone was just in love with his myth-making and his image-making. He loved to hear the sound of his own voice, see his picture in the paper, and see himself quoted in the Chicago Tribune day after day because he was such colorful copy that this ran away with him.
James Wilkerson, who was a judge of massive dignity and probity, just couldn't stand all the editorial comment about how this really is a victory for Al Capone and a defeat for Chicago and a defeat for the government.
Capone's confidence before the trial isn't just bravado. He's already taken the precaution of bribing 10 members of the jury. But in a surprise move, Judge Wilkerson swaps juries with the courtroom next door.
They were unbribed. No one knew about them.
The courtroom dramatics only amplify the public buzz about the trial.
The public's reaction to the trial of Al Capone was mostly amusement. I don't think they believed anyone was going to get Al Capone. Capone himself was certain that they would never get him. And he came in every day beautifully dressed in a new suit, and the cameras were flashing all around him. He was having a field day.
It was very difficult to put together a tax case against Al Capone because he didn't keep any written records. So instead of trying to find out how much income he had, because there seemed to be no way to trace it, even though it was in the hundreds of millions of dollars, they put together a case based on his spending habits. What they did was go around and interview various merchants and ask them how much Capone had spent.
Witness after witness testifies to Al Capone's prodigious spending. It reveals a life of elegant dining, limitless gambling and generous tipping, a world of $30,000 Cadillacs, a mansion in Palm Beach, and hundreds of custom-made suits. The public is enthralled. If the big fella is nervous, he doesn't show it.
People liked him, especially when he's giving out $10, $20 tips in the 1920s. But on the other hand, that sort of ostentation and flashy behavior sort of forces to recognize that there's a problem.
They knew he was Al Capone. They knew he had literally gotten away with murder, and if you literally get away with murder, well, surely it isn't too much to convict him on tax fraud.
He figured he was going to beat the case. As a matter of fact, I think members of the press were all surprised that he was found guilty.
What fails Al in the end is his own defense team. He has two lawyers who don't fight the introduction of evidence that should be inadmissible, who don't protest the statute of limitations, which has run out on all but 4 of the charges. Instead, they rely only on Capone's popularity to defend him. At the time, even Capone doesn't realize the gravity of the situation.
Until then, no one had gotten more than 5 years. Capone got a total of 11 years.
No one is more surprised by the whopping sentence than Al Capone. He spends the night in a county holding cell and is shipped off the next day to the Atlanta penitentiary. Once in prison, Capone is given a physical and more grim news. He has 3rd-stage syphilis, and it's incurable. Eager to keep his time behind bars to a minimum, he becomes a model prisoner. But the public refuses to believe that Scarface Al Capone is no longer king of the underworld. Rumors fly that he's still running his empire from prison. Though the charges are unfounded, the Attorney General demands action be taken. So in the summer of 1934, Al Capone is shipped to the new high-security penitentiary, Alcatraz, the Rock.
Al Capone's final years in Alcatraz were marked mainly by his severe decline due to his neurosyphilis, and it erupted during his time there and left him in a state of dementia. He was often afraid, he often burst into tears, he often hid under his blanket, he thought that angels were talking to him. He was a timid soul. In fact, other inmates there often got into fights with him, and he was stabbed once by a much smaller inmate. But the Al Capone at this point was really just a shell of what he had formerly been.
Capone is released from prison in March of 1940 to a world without the speakeasies and bootleg booze that gave rise to his power. An America free of prohibition, but not the organized crime it created.
Al Capone had outlived much of his fame, his popularity, the notice. And celebrity it fades. His had faded.
Capone returns to his Palm Island villa and his devoted wife. There he spends the rest of his days in quiet seclusion. The one-time high-living, high-rolling big fella now lives off an allowance from his brother Ralph, $600 a week. On January 25th, 1947, Scarface Al Capone meets his end, not in a hail of bullets or at the end of a rope, but from a stroke. Only a handful of people are at his burial. In many ways, Al Capone is the ultimate American success story, with a twist. Poor boy makes good by being bad. He let nothing keep him from success, and his violent temper could unleash a terrifying rage. A brilliant businessman, a master of public relations, he was boldly honest in an age of boozing hypocrisy. The paradox of good and evil in his story still intrigues us. But one thing is certain, Al Capone lived the American dream on his own terms.